It was a Tuesday evening in October of 2013, and Wade Pruitt sat at Clint Murray's kitchen table like a man who had driven a long way and was not entirely sure why he had come. Wade had a good truck parked in the yard. He had leather boots that cost more than Clint's last 3 pairs of work gloves combined, and he had spent 16 years telling anyone in Osage County who would listen that farming without professional financial guidance was like driving a combine at night with no headlights. He was not a bad man. He was a confident man. And there is a difference, though it does not always feel like one, when you are sitting on the receiving end of his certainty. Clint set a mug of coffee in front of him. He did not offer cream or sugar because he had not stocked either in a way that was easy to find, and Wade did not ask. There was a laptop open on the table between them, its screen facing Clint, its glow a pale blue in the kitchen light. Wade looked at it the way a person looks at something they recognize but cannot quite place. He leaned forward slightly. "What program is that?" he said. Clint looked at the screen, then back at Wade. "Spreadsheet," he said. Wade waited, expecting more. "Built it in '94, Clint said. "Still runs." Wade said nothing for a moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator and a dog settling against the baseboard in the next room. And Wade Pruitt, who had built a career on telling farmers what their money should be doing, sat there looking at a 30-column spreadsheet that was older than his business license in the kitchen of a man he had been calling behind the times for the better part of 2 decades, and something behind his eyes went soft and rearranged itself. That moment did not come out of nowhere. Let me tell you how it got there. Clint Murray grew up farming because there was nothing else. The land around Osage County asked of a family like his. His father, Earl, had run 640 acres of corn and soybeans through the 1970s with the particular confidence of a man whose land had always returned what he put into it, plus enough margin to reinvest. Earl borrowed in the late 1970s to expand, the way the county extension agent and the local elevator manager and the farm radio all said to do, because land prices were climbing and interest rates were still something a person could plan around. Then 1980 arrived, and the rates climbed to places no one in the county had planned around. And Earl Murray stood in his own kitchen reading a letter from First National that made his hands shake in a way Clint, who was 12 years old at the time, had never seen his father's hands shake before. Earl did not lose the farm. He came close enough that the word foreclosure became, for the rest of Clint's childhood, a word with weight in it, the way certain tools have weight when you pick them up, a specific and serious heaviness that tells you what they are for. Earl renegotiated. He sold 80 acres on the east side of the property to cover the shortfall. He spent 4 years cutting every discretionary cost he could name, and some he had never bothered to name before, and he came through it. But the farm that came through it was smaller than the one that had gone in. Clint watched all of it. He watched his father read rate notices at the kitchen table. He watched his mother, Leona, keep a notebook of every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out, in a handwriting so precise it looked like a printed ledger. He watched the neighbor 3 miles north, a man named Harold Goss, lose everything in 1985 and auction his equipment in a parking lot in October, while his kids stood at the edge of the crowd in their school clothes and did not know where to look. That auction stayed with Clint longer than most things stayed with him. By 1994, Clint was 31 years old and running the home farm himself, Earl having handed over the day-to-day operations when his back stopped cooperating with that kind of work. Clint had 640 acres, a corn-soybean rotation he had been refining for 6 years, and a used desktop computer that had come with a copy of Lotus 123 already loaded. A county extension agent named Russ Belton had shown him how to build a basic input cost tracking sheet the previous winter. Clint had taken that sheet and kept going. Over the course of that winter and into the spring, he built something that covered 30 columns and as many rows as he needed. It tracked input costs against projected yields at 3 commodity price scenarios. It tracked the relationship between what his land was renting for and what it was selling for, and flagged when the ratio drifted past the threshold he calculated from the 1970s and 1980s, price history he had pulled from the Kansas State Extension Archives. It had a column for operating loan balance, and he had typed a 0 in that column in February of 1994 and had not typed anything else in it since. His father looked at the spreadsheet once and said, "That's your mother's notebook, only it does the math for you." Clint thought that was about right. If you happened to be at the Fenton Hartley Farm Supply on the east side of Linden on a Saturday morning in April of 1997, you might have seen a man named Wade Pruitt standing near the seed display in a shirt that was too clean for the building he was in. Wade had opened his financial advisory and insurance practice 3 months earlier, working out of a rented office on the second floor above the hardware store, and he had decided that Saturday morning at the farm supply was a reasonable place to introduce himself to the farming community. Clint was there for a bag of bolts and a discussion about spray nozzle pressure with a man named Dale Hopper, who ran a custom application outfit and had opinions about nozzle pressure that took a while to fully present. Wade made his way around the store and eventually found himself standing near Clint and Dale, and he introduced himself with the particular warmth of a man who has practiced his introduction. Clint shook his hand, said he was a grain farmer, 640 acres, no partners. Wade asked who managed his financial planning. Clint said he managed it himself. Wade asked what tools he used. Clint said a spreadsheet. Wade smiled, and it was the smile of a man who has heard this before. "A spreadsheet isn't a strategy, friend," he said. "Not if you're serious about growing." Dale Hopper glanced at Clint, just for a second, the way a man does when he wants to see how someone is going to take a thing. Clint looked at Wade for a moment. "Keeping what you have is a strategy," he said. He picked up his bag of bolts and went to the register. Wade watched him go with the expression of someone who has just confirmed what he already suspected, and that was the beginning of the thing between them, which would take 16 years to fully resolve. Now let me tell you about Gary Fenton. Gary farmed 200 acres directly east of Clint's property, land his grandfather had homesteaded, and he was the kind of farmer who wanted to be larger than he was, which is not a moral failure, but a practical one if the numbers do not support the ambition. Gary was friendly, genuinely so. The sort of man who brought a jar of honey from his wife's hives to every gathering and remembered your kids' names and what grade they were in. He and Clint had borrowed each other's equipment for 20 years without a written agreement between them, which was how things worked in that part of the county. In 2002, Gary started talking about expansion. Land to the south had come available, a 480-acre parcel from an estate that needed a quick sale, and the asking price was sitting right around $1,200 an acre. Gary went to First National. First National was lending. The rates in 2002 were not the rates of 1980. And the loan officer, a man named Keith Brower, who had a framed certificate from the Kansas Bankers Association on his wall, told Gary that land values were trending solidly upward and that a financed expansion at these rates was a reasonable business decision. Gary financed the full purchase, $576,000, give or take, on a 20-year note at a rate that seemed manageable in 2002 and would become less manageable in ways Gary had not modeled because Gary did not have a spreadsheet that tracked the relationship between land prices and rental income. Clint ran the numbers through his own spreadsheet when Gary told him about it over the fence one evening in the fall of 2002. The model came back with a flag in the debt service column. The flag meant the land would need to yield above historical average at above average commodity prices for 12 consecutive years to generate the cash flow that would service the note comfortably. Clint told Gary what the model said. Gary said the bank had its own analysis, and he trusted Keith Brower. Clint said, "All right." He did not say it again. Over the next 5 years, Gary's expansion looked, from every visible angle, like the right decision. Commodity prices climbed through 2004 and 2005. Land values in Osage County rose faster than anyone's reasonable model had projected, and by 2006, Gary's 480 new acres had appreciated on paper by something close to 40%. He bought a new green tractor in 2004, a model that had a cab with air conditioning and a GPS guidance system, and he parked it in the equipment shed next to his grandfather's old red tractor, which still ran but which now seemed to belong to a different era, as if the two machines were separated by more than 30 years. Wade Pruitt was Gary's financial advisor by 2003. Wade had built a solid practice by then. He had 12 farming clients in the county, and he had developed what he called a growth equity framework, which was a phrase he had printed on a laminated card that he left on the tables at the Farm Bureau banquets. The framework, in summary, held that financed land acquisition was the single most efficient path to building farm equity, because land in Kansas had never, over any 20-year period in the modern record, lost significant value. He was not wrong about the historical record. He was wrong about whether the historical record could be extrapolated indefinitely, but that particular error was still 3 years from becoming visible. The Farm Bureau banquet in October of 2004 was where Wade said the thing that people in the county still remembered 9 years later. He had been asked to speak for 15 minutes on farm financial planning, and he used the time well, in the sense that he was genuinely engaging and knew his material and believed everything he said. He got around to alternative approaches near the end of his talk, the way a man does when he wants to address a counter-argument before someone else raises it. And he said, "Now there are still farmers in this county running their operations off a piece of paper and a feeling. And I respect the tradition, I do. But that is Depression-era thinking in a 21st century market." He did not say Clint's name. He did not need to. There were 40 people in that room, and roughly 30 of them knew exactly who he was describing, because Clint had been politely declining Wade's advisory services for 7 years by then. And in a county of that size, that kind of declination becomes a known fact. Clint sat 4 tables back and ate his chicken dinner and did not change his expression. Darlene, sitting beside him, put her hand on his forearm once, quickly, then took it back. She did not say anything until they were in the truck driving home, and then she said, "He doesn't know what he's talking about." Clint said, "He thinks he does." "That's worse," Darlene said. That was 2004. By 2007, Darlene had started to wonder privately whether Wade might know more than she wanted to give him credit for. She did not raise it the way a person raises a confrontation. She raised it the way someone asks about the weather when they are actually asking about something else. She came into Clint's office one evening in the spring of 2007 when the corn price was sitting above $4 a bushel, and Gary's expanded acreage had made him one of the larger independent operators in the county, and she stood in the doorway and said, "Gary bought that new pickup, the one with the chrome package." Clint was looking at his spreadsheet. "I know," he said. "He's doing well," she said. "He is right now," Clint said. Darlene stood in the doorway a moment longer. "The spreadsheet still says something different." "The spreadsheet says what it's always said," Clint told her. "The land price to rental income ratio has been outside his range since 2005. He's got 140 acres of that 480 that aren't making back their note payment at current corn prices, and if prices come down 10%, or if his operating costs go up, he's going to need to pull from somewhere else to cover it. There's nowhere else." Darlene was quiet. "And if the prices don't come down?" "They will," Clint said. "Not because I know something, because the spreadsheet says the only time they stayed up this long was the late 70s, and we know how that ended." She went back to the kitchen. She did not say anything else about Gary's chrome package pickup that year. If you want to understand what made Clint's position possible, by 2013, you have to understand what he was doing in the years when everyone around him was doing something more visible. In 2003, while Gary was signing loan papers, Clint paid cash for a rebuilt grain bin that added 15,000 bushels of on-farm storage. In 2004, while the Farm Bureau was hearing about Wade's growth equity framework, Clint bought a used header for his combine at an estate auction for $8,000 and put it to work without adding a dollar of debt. Every year, he ran his input costs through the spreadsheet before the growing season began and compared the projection against the commodity futures for his anticipated harvest window. If the margin looked thin, he planted the soybean rotation on the marginal ground and held the corn acres for the better producing fields. He kept a passbook savings account at the county savings institution and a ladder of short-term certificates of deposit that he rolled over every 6 months. He did not think of this as sophisticated. He thought of it as what his mother's notebook had always suggested. Money that is not owed to anyone is the only money that behaves reliably. By the end of 2007, Clint had set aside a little over $200,000 in those accounts. His operating loan balance was still zero. His equipment was paid for. His home farm was paid for. His land taxes were current and had never been late. Nobody in the county knew those numbers. He had not told anyone. He drove a truck that had gone past 230,000 miles and which he maintained himself in the machine shed on Saturday afternoons. He wore the same canvas work jacket he had bought in 1998, with a tear on the left elbow that Darlene had stitched twice, and he had not bothered to restitch after that. When people saw him at the elevator or the co-op, they saw a farmer who appeared to be getting by, which was roughly how Clint preferred to be seen. The spring of 2008 was when the spreadsheet's 2006 flag began to mean something in the physical world rather than just in a column of numbers. Input costs rose sharply through the first quarter. Diesel moved up in a way that affected everyone's cost per acre calculation, and fertilizer prices followed because fertilizer is made from natural gas. And natural gas was moving with the oil price in a way that was consistent and punishing. Credit markets were tightening nationally, and while Kansas farmland was not yet showing the same distress as other asset classes, the rental income that was supposed to service Gary's note had not kept pace with the operating costs that were now eating into his margin. Clint's spreadsheet had a column for input cost inflation. It had always had one, because his father had told him that the invisible cost of farming was not the thing you bought, but the way the thing you bought kept getting more expensive faster than the thing you sold. In 2008, that column was read for the first time since 1999, when a late-season input cost spike had come out of nowhere, and Clint had handled it because he had cash in his accounts and no debt service competing for that cash. By late 2008, Gary was not calling Clint about equipment loans. He was not calling about much, because things that are going wrong on a farm have a way of making a man quieter in the places where he used to be easy and social. Clint saw him at the elevator in October, and Gary looked like a man who was managing not to say something. Clint did not press him. He bought Gary's wife's honey at the farm market in November and left it at that. Now, if you have been watching the national news in 2009 and 2010, you know what was happening to credit markets and land valuations in that period. Kansas farmland was not immune. The values that had made Gary's 480-acre purchase look brilliant on paper, in 2006 began to level, and in some parcels, to soften. And at the same time, First National tightened its review of outstanding agricultural loans in a way that Keith Brower's framed certificate from the Kansas Bankers Association had not prepared any of his clients for. By 2010, Gary was carrying a debt service on his 480 acres that his cash flow could no longer meet in full. He had sold equipment. He had rented out his grandfather's old acreage and taken on part-time work at the co-op warehouse to cover the gap. None of it was enough. His wife told a mutual friend of Darlene's that Gary had stopped sleeping through the night sometime around February of 2010 and had not slept through the night since. The foreclosure notice came in the spring of 2011. The auction was scheduled for August. Clint drove to that auction by himself. He did not tell Darlene where he was going, not specifically, because Darlene would have asked questions he did not have good short answers for. He wore his canvas work jacket and his usual boots, and he sat in the back row and watched 80 acres of Gary's 480 go through the block at a price that was considerably below what Gary had paid per acre in 2003. He raised his paddle for those 80 acres when the bidding stalled at $930, and nobody bid against him, and that was that. He wrote the check that afternoon, $74,400. He did not tell anyone he had done it for 3 weeks, at which point the county recorder's office made it a matter of public record, and people found out the way people find out things in a county that size, which is to say, through the feed store and the coffee shop and the co-op counter, in that order. Gary was not at the auction. He had stayed home. He came by Clint's place 2 days after the purchase became known, stood at the edge of the porch, and said, "I didn't know you'd be there." "I know," Clint said. Gary looked at the ground for a moment. "I owe you more than the acreage," he said. "You don't," Clint said. "The ground was worth buying." Gary drove home. He had lost 320 acres in the foreclosure, and the remaining 180 he had managed to retain were encumbered by a renegotiated note that would take him another decade to work through. He was out of the expansion business. He was, in some ways that could not be precisely calculated, out of the version of himself that had believed the spreadsheet was not necessary. Wade Pruitt had lost 4 clients to foreclosure by the end of 2011, Gary not among them, only because Gary had never technically been his client. 2 others had surrendered equipment under voluntary repossession agreements. 3 more had survived, but had spent 18 months in conversations with their lenders that had aged them visibly. Wade's practice had not collapsed. He was good at what he did, and his insurance side had held steady. But the clients who had followed his growth equity framework and financed heavily into land between 2002 and 2007 had paid for it in ways that were not abstract. Wade drove out to Clint's place in October of 2013. He had called ahead, which Clint credited him for. He had not called to sell anything. He had said on the phone, in a voice that was quieter than the voice that had said a spreadsheet, is not a strategy back in 1997, that he had been thinking about the past 10 years and that he thought Clint might have something worth talking about. Clint had said to come out on Tuesday evening. Darlene made coffee and then found something to do in the back of the house. She had opinions about Wade Pruitt that she kept to herself because Clint had asked her to keep them to herself, and she respected that even when it cost her something. Wade sat down, and Clint opened the laptop, and that is where this story began, with a man looking at a 30-column spreadsheet on a Tuesday night and asking what program it was. After Clint told him it was a spreadsheet from 1994, Wade was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee mug in his hands once. "Does it work?" he said. "It flagged the land price ratio in 2006, Clint said. Flagged input costs in 2008. Told me Gary's debt service was underwater in 2002, though I already knew that from the arithmetic." Wade looked at the screen more carefully. He was not a man who understood spreadsheet construction in any technical sense, but he understood enough to see that the columns had internal logic and that the logic had been consistently applied. "How much of this is original?" he said. "Same formulas," Clint said. "Updated numbers every year. The ratio thresholds are what I built in '94. Wade set down his coffee. "What else does it say right now?" Clint scrolled to the bottom of the current year's sheet. He turned the laptop so Wade could see the summary row. 340,000 in the passbook and CDs, he said. 0 operating debt. The 640 home acres free and clear. 80 new acres free and clear, picked up at the auction. He let Wade read the numbers. "The spreadsheet says I should be looking at whether to lease another 160 acres in the next several years, depending on rental market." Wade read the numbers. He did not say anything for a while. When he did speak, he said, "I owe you an apology, Clint." Clint looked at him. "For what, specifically?" "For the Depression-era thinking line," Wade said. "I said it twice at Farm Bureau, and I said it at the co-op counter in 2006 when someone asked me about your operation, and I was wrong all 3 times. Clint nodded once. He was not the kind of man who needed to hear something repeated. "Spreadsheet saw it coming," he said. "I just trusted it." Wade left about an hour later. He did not become a different person after that night, but he became a somewhat more careful version of himself. His clients heard less about the growth equity framework in the years that followed. He started asking more questions about debt service ratios before he made recommendations, and his answers took longer to arrive than they used to. That is as much correction as a man like Wade was going to accept, and Clint thought it was probably enough. Here is what the spreadsheet had been doing across all of those years. While Wade was building his practice and Gary was expanding, and the county was deciding what things were worth, it had been tracking a simple and unflashy principle that Clint's mother, Leona, had understood before the spreadsheet existed. The money that matters is not the money you are earning in the good years. It is the money you still have in the bad ones. Clint had never said this in a public room. He had never put it in a letter or conversation or speech at the Farm Bureau. He had just run the numbers through the model every year and let the model keep score. The years between 2013 and 2019 were quiet ones by comparison. Clint farmed his 720 acres, which is what the home farm plus the 80 auction acres totaled, and he ran the numbers the same way he always had. Corn went through a soft period in 2014 and 2015 when prices dropped below $4 and a lot of operators who had financed at the post-2010 land prices found themselves in the same conversation with their lenders that Gary's neighbors had been having in 2010. Clint's spreadsheet flagged the margin compression in late 2013, and he rotated more acres to soybeans for 2014 and 2015 and came through it without drawing on reserves. He also started thinking about Mia. Mia was his and Darlene's granddaughter, 22 years old in 2019, home from 2 years studying agronomy at Kansas State. She had grown up on and near the farm, and she had the quality that Clint had always valued above credentials or certifications, which was that she asked the right questions and then waited for the actual answers instead of the comfortable ones. She had called her grandfather 3 times during her second year at school to ask about input cost models and rotation management, and each time Clint had answered for as long as she wanted to stay on the phone. She came back to Osage County in the spring of 2019 and told Clint she wanted to farm. She had some savings from 2 years of part-time work. She had no debt. She did not have a financial advisor, and she did not want one. She had from the previous Christmas a copy of Clint's spreadsheet that he had exported to a modern format for her and sent by email, with a note that said the formulas were from 1994 and had not needed updating. Clint spent the summer of 2019 watching her work. She was methodical, and she was not impatient, which is a combination rarer than it should be in a person of 22. She asked before she did things, and she listened to the answers. She kept notes in a notebook that reminded Clint, in its precision and its density of small written figures, of his mother's ledger. Clint ran the lease proposal through the spreadsheet in the late summer of 2023, when Mia had been back 4 years and had established that she was not going to lose interest or move to Wichita for a salary. He looked at the rental market in the county, which was sitting around $140 an acre for dry land crop ground. He looked at what Mia could realistically cash flow in her first 3 years without carrying a net operating loss. He looked at the reserve column on his own sheet and at the fact that he and Darlene had no mortgage and no debt, and more than enough in the laddered CDs to cover any eventuality he could model. He set the lease rate at $80 per acre. Darlene looked at the number when he showed her. "That's not market rate," she said. "No," Clint agreed. "You're giving her $60 an acre." "On 100C 60 acres, Clint said. "That's $9,600 a year she gets to keep instead of paying out. Over 3 years, that's $28,800 she can put against equipment, or seed, or her first option payment." Darlene looked at the number for another moment. "Your father gave 80 acres away to keep the farm," she said. "He didn't give them away," Clint said. "He sold them because he had to. That's different." "I know," she said. "That's my point." The lease agreement was signed in the spring of 2024. 160 acres of the home farm's perimeter ground, the parcels Clint had already identified as better suited to a smaller operation scale, leased to Mia at $80 per acre, with a first option to purchase at a fixed price should she choose to exercise it within 10 years. The terms were not complicated. They were written on 2 pages and signed at the kitchen table on a Tuesday, which seemed to be the day that the kitchen table at the Murray place did its most significant work. Gary Fenton came to the signing because Mia had asked him to come, and because Clint had said that was fine. Gary had spent 13 years farming his retained 180 acres with a care and a conservatism that he had not brought to the 2003 expansion, and the note on those acres was nearly retired. He sat at the corner of the table and did not say much, but when Mia signed her name, he looked at the paper and then looked at Clint and said, "She's got a better start than I had." She made the start herself, Clint said. We just smoothed the road a little. Gary nodded. He understood what that meant in a way that did not require elaboration. The night of the signing, after Gary had driven home, and Mia had gone out to walk the field margins in the last of the afternoon light, Darlene went to the shelf in the small room that had once been Leona's sewing room and came back to the kitchen with Leona's ledger notebook. She set it on the table next to the laptop. The notebook had a cloth cover that had faded from green to something closer to gray, and the spine had been taped once with electrical tape that had since dried and curled at the edges. Mia came in from the field and saw the two things side by side, the notebook and the laptop. "What's the notebook?" she said. "Your great-grandmother's," Darlene said. She tracked every dollar in and out for 30 years. When Clint built the spreadsheet, he used her categories. Mia opened it to the middle and looked at the handwriting for a moment. Then she set it down carefully and looked at the laptop screen, at the column headers that had been there since 1994, still running at the top of the page. "It's the same thing," she said. "Yes," Clint said. Mia looked at the screen a moment longer. She pulled the laptop toward her and scrolled slowly through the columns, reading the headers. The kitchen was quiet. The lamp above the table gave everything in the room the same warm yellow cast it had always given. Outside, the 160 acres she had just committed herself to were dark under a clear October sky, and the remaining 560 were quiet, in the same way they had always been quiet, which was the quiet of ground that has been worked honestly and is resting. Clint watched her read. He thought about his father reading the letter from First National with shaking hands. He thought about Harold Goss's kids at the edge of that October auction in 1985, standing in their school clothes. He thought about Gary raising the lid on a chrome package pickup that he could not quite afford in the years when everything looked like it was working. He thought about Wade Pruitt saying Depression era, thinking in front of 40 neighbors and meaning it as a slight and accidentally saying the truest thing about Clint's method that anyone had ever said out loud, because the Depression had taught his grandmother, and his grandmother had taught his mother, and his mother had taught her notebook, and her notebook had taught the spreadsheet. Mia stopped scrolling. She looked up at him. "The ratio threshold," she said. "The one in column 17. Is that based on your calculation or something you pulled from somewhere?" "My calculation," Clint said. "Based on 1940 through 1993, price and rental history. Have you updated it? Every year? Has it ever been wrong?" Clint looked at the screen. He thought about 1999 when the input cost flag had come up, and he had kept his cash reserves instead of expanding, and he had been right. He thought about 2006 when the land price flag had come up, and he had held his position instead of buying, and he had been right. He thought about 2002 when the debt service flag on Gary's proposed purchase had come up, and he had told Gary, and Gary had done it anyway. And the flag had been right, even though the timing had taken 9 years to prove it. "Not about anything that mattered," he said. Mia nodded. She pulled the notebook closer to her and laid it open next to the laptop so both were visible at once, the handwriting from 1964 beside the column headers from 1994. "Can you show me how you built it?" she said. Clint pulled a chair over and sat down beside her. The spreadsheet was still running.